Okay, and welcome back to War Game with me, Gary. What you can see here is my First World War, 1914 French Infantry and some Marines. Yeah, there's a Marine at the front there. I think there's about 8 Marines. This is from quite a large group of figures I bought a long time ago. Now, I wasn't going to... When I bought these, and it's those things you always think, if I'd have known what I know now, I would have taken real advantage of it. So when these were on sale, there was an awful lot of First World War figures, all Renegade, and I was like, at that time I wasn't really into, this is like 20 years ago, I wasn't really into First World War. I was always interested in it, but I never really spent much time studying it. I wish I had, because it's a fascinating period, and really, what I used to think, because of the research I've been doing, I've really had to rethink what, my thoughts about it, especially in regards to the French army, I would say. Yeah. So anyway, I will get into that. First off, I just want to go through where I am at the moment. These are really on the way. I've got to do the pouches, which were a different colour. So I've done all the black leather, all the blue obviously, you can see the blue coats, that hides an awful lot, doesn't it? I've done the hats, I've put the blue cover on the hats just to protect them. I've done, what else, the feet, the leggings, so the boot and gaiters. That's quite interesting. So why don't I'll just go into my spiel. So I had intended initially to paint the light coloured khaki for the strapping on the lower leg, until doing some research, and it was only the smallest bit of research, to find out that the French army of 1914 didn't actually wear the strapping, not like the British and other nations. They stuck with the black boots with black garters. Well, they'd have black boots anyway, but the black garters. It wasn't until 1915 that they started wearing the strapping. All of these troops are also wearing the cappy, and this is why I've chose 1914, because I really wanted to do the cap or the cappy, and the red iconic trousers. Now I've copied Osprey here for the cap, and I've put the cover on. So, and I put the cover on because I do intend to get probably another regiment of French infantry, and I will do them with the red cap. But I wanted these to have the cover like the Osprey image does in the book, and there was a reason for that, because I wanted to point out that officers, of course the officers, cut a hole in the cover so that you could see the braiding on their hat, which I thought was really interesting, and even more interesting, because obviously it shows them as officers. So I'm sure the Germans were really grateful of them showing off their, that bit of braiding on their hat. But I suppose that's just the way it was. I don't know. Now, in regards to the French uniform, contrary to popular belief, there is no proof that the bright coloured hats and trousers made them easy targets, from a distance anyway. It is probably much more likely that it was the shiny bayonets and the other bits of metal that they wore that actually picked them out and made them easier to target. Now, somewhere where I have suffered because of my lack of interest, sure, but lack of knowledge, I would certainly say. Generally, I think British people, well, perhaps I shouldn't say that, but generally me, so that's someone who has no idea or very little knowledge of this period, seem to have the conception that the French troops had no stomach for the fighting. Yeah, that was really interesting. I don't know where that comes from for me. I don't know if that was Hollywood, or I don't know if that's what my brother had told me, you know, one of my brothers had told me. I don't know, you know, or if somebody at school had said that. But I've never challenged that concept. It never occurred to me to challenge it. But of course, now doing the research, I'm finding out a lot more. It did not take me long to realise, and not very long at all, that nothing could have been further from the truth. And that, in actual fact, they were bold and courageous. They actually lost thousands and thousands of men who followed the commands of their officers literally to the letter and died in their hundreds of thousands in the early part, and this is in the early part of the war. Now there is some of the research I've come across, and I will go into that a little bit more, but there's this thing that there's a strong probability that all nations fight their last wars. Unfortunately, the French, their last war before this was was about 70 years ago, in the Franco-Prussian War, where they were I mean, to be fair, they were outclassed by a modern organised Prussian army. Unfortunately, the High Command, and to be fair, most of the middle rank commanders as well, had drawn the wrong conclusions from their last war, the Franco-Prussian War. Mainly because modern warfare was changing at such an astonishing rate, and France was it's got to be said, and the High Command were very, very slow to catch up. And therefore, the French High Command believed that the way to counter what had happened in the last war was to be even more enthusiastic for the bayonet charge, like an ethos on, or an enthusiastic concentration on elan, so that, you know, really gutsy, let's in your face fighting, and getting in close with the enemy. It proved to be disastrous for the very brave troops. I mean, the troops were extremely brave, like bayonet charge after bayonet charge, and they were just mown down. I mean, absolutely mown down, shot to pieces. If you then compound this with the heavily bureaucratic, penny-pinching approach to the war, never a good approach for any war, it cost the army thousands of troops unnecessarily. A good example of this would be and possibly the most damaging at this time, was their terrible approach to the army's artillery. So instead of increasing the numbers and modernising this arm of the army, they decided not to greatly increase, because they already had large numbers of stock from the previous war. So what they decided to do was try and tweak what they already had to make it better. So of course, that proved to be so unsuccessful. I mean, they were so outgunned. I mean, even in the 1950s, so 1940s, they were severely outgunned. I mean, infantry just were not being supported by artillery for lots of reasons, but one of the big ones was they just didn't have the firepower to match what the Germans had. They were so under-resourced. I would hope that if that happened now, it would be criminal. And I don't know how many people have heard that. And again, I don't know where this comes from. They used to refer to the British Army in the First World War as lions led by donkeys. Well, if that's so of the British, I think you would have to say that was so of the French. The French troops were extremely brave. They followed they believed in their commanders, and they followed their orders to the letter, and they just went forward with so much courage and enthusiasm. I mean, they were geared up, in order to do that. I mean, nowadays you'd have to fill them with something to do that, but that's what they did, and they died in their thousands. So I'd like to say, if that is true, that they used to say about the British Army, that the troops were lions led by donkeys, I would like to add to that the French troops, not the High Command. I think that at that period in 1914, the High Command were woefully inadequate to deal with the circumstances at that time. Now, what I have been doing, and so a lot of those, what I've been saying is from the research I've been doing, and I've been reading, obviously, Osprey and some other bits and pieces, and I don't get a lot of time to do the reading I would like to, so I generally, in the evenings, I switch on YouTube, and that's been where I've been getting most of my information, but I like to think it's been from credible sources. So the two things I'm watching at the moment, the ones which are probably giving me the most things to think about and to consider whilst I'm doing this, is the first one's from the National World War One Museum lectures, namely Brigadier General Robert Dougherty, and then there's another video, and there's a whole group of those videos. So if you want to go and watch them, I would really, if you're interested in the First World War, National World War One Museum lecture. I think there's about 6 of them. They are well worth having a look, and they concentrate on each army individually. So very well worth doing. And then there's the Western Front Association, and the guy I was watching, but there are lots of different speakers. There's a guy called Dr. Jonathan Cruz on YouTube. So there are loads, or like I said, there are loads of speakers on this channel as well. And it's just, I mean, it's well worth a look, and I must admit, I'm really enjoying it, and it's changing the way I think about the First World War, and specifically the French army in the First World War. Of course, you're going to get disagreement. People who study any war, it doesn't matter which war they study, professional historians and doctors in history, and particularly in like for this example, the First World War, they disagree. They often have disagreements. You know, they have opposing views and different opinions on what and why something actually happened. But hopefully, as my knowledge grows, I'm not doing that critical analytical thing. I'm just listening and learning. Probably later on I will start saying, well, actually somebody challenges that, and if you look at the time and what was going on, and maybe if you consider the uniforms they were wearing and the artillery that was available, then it makes more sense to agree with this other guy. But at the moment I'm just listening to what they're saying, and be honest, I like to think I'm taking it in like a spoon. Now Dr. Jonathan Cruz, he discusses in some detail the enthusiasm of the troops in 1914, and that goes back to what I was saying, and that's where I got most of that from. What he says, he talks about how they relied on the enthusiasm of the troops to get in close. He then talks about, well, he then touches on how the changes after being used as cannon fodder, they lost some of their enthusiasm. When they lost, I'm talking about when I say they, the troops lost some of their enthusiasm because they were being thrown up against machine guns and cannon. Yeah, artillery was smashing them to pieces. And after a year of that, I mean, I'm surprised they kept going for a year, but after a year of that, you start to lose faith in your commanders, and I think that's probably what happened. And he talks specifically about one example, or one particular incident, where a general ordered his troops to be pistol whipped to leave the trenches. Now, you might remember I said a lot of these commanders were woefully incompetent at that time. this is his approach to, they've been used as cannon fodder. They are now refusing. They were close to having a mutiny. I think that they were close on several occasions to having a mutiny. And his approach to it was to increase to increase their enthusiasm by pistol whipping them. I mean, this is, yeah. Would that happen now? I would like to think not. Leastways, not by a Western army. I mean, you know, there are other armies. Yeah, I'm a massive fan of the Western world, and I think the rest of the world is woefully behind us in many things, including human rights. So I don't think that would happen now in a Western army. Good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. But certainly in my view, yeah, good thing or a bad thing is probably not the right thing to say. It's effective is probably what I was looking for. Whether it be effective now, you know, forcing troops to fight, you know, by pistol whipping them out of the trenches, I don't know. I think the judge would have to be out on that one, but I wouldn't like to see it. Then we come to the statements that I made about the commanders at that time for the French, and probably I don't think so much for the Germans, maybe a bit for the British and other nations, but Brigadier General Robert Doherty, he talks about the appointment of General Joffre as Commander-in-Chief, and the passing over of other commanders, and also how the French relied on the Franco-Russian alliance. I mean, that was their foundation to the French planning. It wasn't, you know, contrary to what a lot of British people think, that it was the British and French, certainly in the early part of the war, who had the alliance. The French depended on the Russian alliance, so it's much more that. General Doherty, he clearly points out that they were much more concentrated on the Franco-Russian alliance, and he even talks about how terrible the relationship between the British and the French were, particularly with certain commanders, and one particular French commander, which really hindered the Western Front approach to war, because the information just wasn't being shared, but both ways. But it was just a terrible relationship at that time. He also talks about how French intelligence had got hold of a copy of the German mobilisation plan, and even though the Germans stated that the Reserve Corps would be used as active corps, the French intelligence, for want of a better word, and high command refused to use this information in their own plans. So when they were making their own plans to fight the Germans, they didn't use this vital information. Therefore, in the planning, the French High Command did not account for 5 whole corps in their attack plan. And by doing that, they calculated that the war would be over very quickly. So Joffre, he therefore, I mean, this plan was flawed, and he decided not to contest Brie or Lille, which were the places that provided the majority of their iron, their iron ore, and their coal. So of course, the reason they didn't contest, because they wanted to contest in other places, because they didn't realise they hadn't factored in the other 5 corps. So of course they lost Brie and Lille, and therefore couldn't reproduce their own iron and run their own factories, because the coal and iron had been taken over by the Germans. I mean, woefully inadequate thinking from Joffre. I said about how Dr. Cruz stated there was an overuse of bayonet charges with very little or no heavy artillery support, and General Doherty picks up on that as well. General Doherty points out that the French High Command, so Joffre, believed that by having heavy artillery attached to the infantry would slow them down too much. And he identifies the Battle of, now I might not have, if I'm murdering the French language here, I do apologise, Rossignol, the Battle of Rossignol, how 10,500 casualties were inflicted by using these tactics, so bayonet charges with no heavy artillery cover. And I believe that was in no more than a day's fighting. 10,000 men died because of them tactics. Doherty also points out that although the Battle of Le Mans worked out for Joffre and the generals, that doesn't excuse his really rubbish command of and his rubbish planning of the whole 1914 campaign. Of course, the first thing I did, and I always do this, first thing I always throw out the window is Hollywood. Hollywood just seem to make up, and they don't seem to, for whatever reason, they don't seem to like the West. I don't know what that's about. It's very weird, but from about 2005, films I've seen, I've gone, oh, yeah, I really like that. And then I learn about it, and you go, and then you realise, oh, that's not quite how that worked, and that's not why that happened. And yeah, so it just, I think Hollywood needs to do some serious history courses to find out what's going on, because they do seem to be off the mark at the moment. So that's my update, where I am with my figures, and also a bit of my research I'm doing and the things that I'm finding out. Now, what I would say, and I touched on this earlier, people have other ideas and opinions of, you know, from what they learn, and they take information, and I think we all do this. We all take information differently. I'll read something, and it'll mean something slightly different to what somebody else says. If you've anything I've said, if you disagree with that, and I kind of hope you do, because then I'll learn. You know, if you tell me, no, that's not actually true, it was actually this guy, or this happened, or my pronunciation is rubbish, that's great, because then I learn from that. So yeah, so it's a longer video, but I wanted to just, yeah, I mean, this update, I really wanted to talk a bit about my previous views of the French army and how that's changed. And there's a lot of similarities there between the French and the British. You know, if it's true that, you know, the saying was lions led by donkeys, then it does seem, you know, then it would follow that. If anybody knows where that came from as well, let me know. I'd really like to know where that came from. I'd like to know, was it just my brother making that up? Or did it, or was that something they actually said? And if that was the case, then I think you would have to put that title on the French troops as well. In 1914, I don't think there were any braver troops on the battlefield. So yeah, so that's me done. I'll speak to you all next Friday. All the best. Take care. Bye bye.